Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this afternoon. And before I get into my remarks, I want to express a word of appreciation for your service as elected officials to our country. I was a mayor of the city of Burlington, Vermont, the largest city in the state, for 8 years. I was in Congress for 16 years, and I've been in the Senate now for 9 years. And I know, as you do, that public service is not an easy task, that it has an impact on your families, on your kids, and that sometimes to get elected, you have to deal with horrendous, ugly advertising and comments about you. And it's not a pleasant experience. But what you understand is that for a democracy to survive, we need serious people running for office, discussing serious issues, and I thank you very much for your willingness to do that. Today I want to talk about two major issues facing our country. And the first is the need for comprehensive immigration reform. It is not acceptable to me, and I think a growing majority of the American people, that millions of folks in this country are working extremely hard, but they are living in the shadows, and that has got to end. And the second issue that I want to touch on is that we need an economy today which benefits all of our people, the middle class, working families, lower income people, and not just a handful of billionaires. It is no great secret that across the United States, undocumented workers perform a critical role in our economy. They harvest and process our food, and it is no exaggeration to say that without them, food production and agriculture in this country would significantly decline. Undocumented workers build many of our homes, they cook our meals, they maintain our landscapes. We even entrust undocumented workers with that which we hold most dear, the well-being of our children. Despite the central role that undocumented workers play in our economy and in our daily lives, these workers are too often reviled by many for political gain and shunted into the shadows. Let me be very clear as to where I stand. It is time for this disgraceful situation to end. This country faces enormous problems, and they will not be solved unless we are united. It is time to end the politics of division in this country, of politicians playing one group of people off against another group, whether it is white against black, male against female, straight against gay, or native-born against immigrant. That division has got to end. And that is why I supported the 2013 comprehensive immigration reform legislation in the U.S. Senate. While a complicated piece of comprehensive legislation like this can always be improved, and this legislation can be improved, I believe then and I believe now that it is time to end the discussion of quote-unquote mass deportation or quote-unquote self-deportation. We cannot and we should not be talking about sweeping up millions of men, women, and children many of whom have been in this country for years, and we cannot allow a continuation of this discussion or these ideas that suddenly we're going to throw millions of people out of this country. That is wrong, and that type of discussion must end now. Until we finally pass comprehensive reform, and I would very much like to see the House of Representatives pick up where the Senate left off, we must be aggressive in pursuing policies that are humane and sensible and that keep families together. This includes taking measures that are currently available, including reforms through executive action. I strongly support the administration's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. DACA is a good first step, but should be expanded. Deferred action should include the parents of citizens, parents of legal permanent residents, and the parents of dreamers. It makes common sense to me, and I think all people of goodwill, that we should be pursuing policies that unite families, not tear them apart. I continue to be a strong supporter of the DREAM Act, which would offer the opportunity of permanent residency and eventual citizenship to young people who are brought to the United States as children. It is my belief that we should recognize the young men and women who comprise the Dreamers for what they are, American kids who deserve the right to legally be in the country they know as home. As has often been stated, we are a nation of immigrants. That is, in fact, the strength of America. For generations, families braved treacherous paths, often fleeing unspeakable poverty and violence and prejudice in search of better futures, for better lives for their kids. I myself am the son of an immigrant. My dad came to this country from Poland at the age of 17 without a nickel in his pocket and without much of an education. Like immigrants before and since, he worked hard to give his family a better life here in the United States and was the proudest American that you have ever seen. He was a paint salesman, and he never made much money, and we were solidly lower middle class. My parents, my brother, and I lived together in a small rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, New York. My mother's wish, which she never realized because she died young, was that someday she could own a home of her own and move out of the apartment in which I was raised. She never accomplished that goal, but she and my dad were able to have her two kids go to college. First people in that family to go to college. No small thing. Brothers and sisters, their family, my story, your story, our story, is the story of America, and we should be proud of that story. Hard-working families coming to the United States to create a brighter future for their kids. It is a story rooted in family and fueled by hope. It is a story that continues to this day in families all across America. Let me tell you that I have seen firsthand the impact of our broken immigration system. In 2007, my Senate office learned about a crisis occurring with migrant laborers in the tomato fields of Immokalee, Florida. Any folks from Florida here? All right, you know where Immokalee is, right? All right. The Immokalee workers, and these are the workers, were the workers, who pick the tomatoes that you get on your hamburger at Burger King and McDonald's. These workers were fighting desperately to increase their paltry wages and get better working conditions for the backbreaking work that they perform. In January of 2008, I went to Immokalee and I looked at the situation, armed with a letter of support signed by 3 of my colleagues, Senator Dick Durbin, Sherrod Brown, and the late Ted Kennedy. What I discovered was a human tragedy. Workers were being paid starvation wages, living in severely substandard housing, and subjected to abusive labor practices. The injustices of the lives of the workers was overwhelming. In fact, and this is true, it just so happens that on the day that I was there in Immokalee, on that day, 2 men were indicted for human slavery, for forcing workers to engage in involuntary labor. That's how bad the situation was. Slavery in the 21st century in the fields of Immokalee in the United States of America. My visit there to the tomato fields was followed by a hearing in the Senate Health, Education, Labor Committee, on which I sat and still sit, and which was then chaired by my good friend, the late Senator Ted Kennedy. At that hearing, we heard the voices of Immokalee, workers who were at the lowest rung of the economic ladder, workers who had no rights, because if they stood up for their rights, they could be arrested and deported. Now, I am happy to tell you that that particular story had a positive ending. The campaign by the Immokalee workers resulted in substantial reforms in the tomato fields of Florida, and in the aggregate, workers there have seen their wages increase by millions of dollars, and they have seen significant improvements in their working conditions. But how many more Immokalees are there? How many fields or factories are there where people, often without legal status, are used up and thrown away? We cannot continue to run an economy where millions are made so vulnerable because of their undocumented status. We have to ask ourselves, who benefits from this exploitation? And to understand that it is not only the undocumented workers who suffer, but every worker in America, because that pushes us into a race to the bottom. Many in the business community have argued for guest worker programs as the answer to the immigration issue, and that concerns me very much. As the Southern Poverty Law Center has documented, guest workers have been routinely cheated out of wages, held virtually captive by employers who have seized their documents, forced to live in unspeakably inhumane conditions, and denied medical benefits for on-the-job injuries. That is unacceptable. In the U.S. Senate, I have introduced legislation in 2007 that would authorize the Legal Services Corporation to provide legal representation to guest workers who have been abused by their employers. Further, Employers under my bill would be required to reimburse guest workers for transportation expenses and provide workers compensation insurance, among other things. I also opposed tying immigration reform to the building of a border fence. Let me say what most people already know. Undocumented workers come to the United States to escape economic hardship and political persecution. Undocumented workers looking for economic opportunity come to the United States because there are no jobs from where they are coming, and there are jobs here. And that's the plain and simple reason. And I will add to that that unfortunately, U.S. policy in Latin America has too often made difficult economic and political problems even worse. For example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I am proud to tell you I voted against. Supporters of NAFTA, and I remember it like it was yesterday, they told us that would increase the standard of living in Mexico and significantly reduce the flow of undocumented immigrants into this country as a result. Sadly, the very opposite was true. Since the implementation of NAFTA, the number of Mexicans living below the poverty line has increased by over 14 million people. Almost 2 million small farmers have been displaced. And in the 20 years since NAFTA, growth in per capita GDP has been only half of that experienced by other Latin American countries. Not surprisingly, as a result of all of that, we have seen a 185% increase in the number of undocumented immigrants from Mexico from 1992 to 2011. We as a nation have got to recognize the importance of dealing not just with the issue of immigration, but with the very real refugee crisis that we face. It was appalling to me that last year, when the papers were full of discussion about the large numbers of unaccompanied children at the borders, there were so many voices insisting that these kids be turned away or simply shipped back to their country of origin like a package marked return to sender. America has always been a haven for the oppressed. Is there any group more vulnerable than children? We cannot and must not shirk the historic role of the United States as a protector of vulnerable people fleeing persecution. Now, the bottom line of all of this, and this is not going to happen tomorrow, it is not going to happen without a lot of debate and with a lot of compromise. But the bottom line is that it is the time to bring our neighbors out of the shadows. It is time to give them legal status. It is time to create a reasonable and responsible path to citizenship. In addition to immigration reform, we must also pursue policies that empower minority communities. Now, like everybody else in this room, we are politicians, and we have got to go before the people to get elected. And I hope that you will agree with me that when you are in a campaign and in an election, you hope that your ideas and who you are prevail. And I hope that you will agree with me that there is something very wrong all over this country when good ideas are not prevailing because of voter suppression in one state after another. Now, it seems to me that anybody who runs for office should have the guts to stand up to his or her constituents and argue for their votes. It is only cowards who cannot defend their positions who do everything that they can to lower voter turnout and suppress the vote. And we have got to end that type of suppression. Furthermore, above and beyond immigration issues, we must address the state of our economy today, in which the great middle class of America is disappearing, in which we have 45 million Americans living in poverty, while at the same time the wealthiest people and the largest corporations are doing phenomenally well. Today, shamefully, we have more than 12 million Latinos living in poverty. This is nearly 1 out of every 4 Latinos in this country. If you are a Latino child, there is nearly a 1 in 3 chance that you are growing up in poverty. Many of those people living in poverty today are working long hours. Sometimes they are working at 2 or 3 jobs. And that is why, if we are going to improve lives for the poorest people in this country, we have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. $7.25 an hour, frankly speaking, is a starvation wage. The city of Los Angeles last month raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour over a period of a few years. We have got to do the same in Washington. And when we talk about the economy, we have got to understand that unemployment in this country is much, much too high. Real unemployment, including those people who have given up looking for work or who are working part-time, is close to 11%. And here is another issue that we do not talk about anywhere near enough. We need to address the crisis, the serious crisis of youth unemployment. The Economic Policy Institute, which is an excellent research arm in Washington, D.C., they recently published a paper in which they said that white and Hispanic youth unemployment, including those who are working part-time, who want to work full-time, is over 30%. African American youth unemployment, ages 17 to 20, is over 50%. That is unacceptable. Instead of spending more and more money on incarceration and jails, let's provide jobs and education for those young people. And when we talk about the economy, what we also must understand is that women workers today are making 78 cents on the dollar compared to men doing the same work. That's got to end. We need pay equity for women workers. All of you know that today we are in a very competitive situation in the global economy. And if we are going to be successful and expand the middle class rather than see it shrink, if we are going to give opportunity to low-income and working-class kids, we need the best educated workforce in the world. To my mind, it is beyond comprehension, inexplicable, how we can allow a situation to exist today when we have hundreds of thousands of bright young people who want to go to college or get a higher education but can't do it because their families lack the money. That is grossly unfair to those young people who want to make it to the middle class, and it is absurd when we talk about the future economy of America. And that is why I have recently introduced legislation which would make every public college and university in America tuition-free. And that is not only important to kids who are in the 11th or 12th grade and are struggling with whether or not they're going to go to college. It is important for kids in the 4th grade and the 5th grade. Because if the word gets out to those kids that no matter what the income is of their family, that if they study hard and do their schoolwork seriously, they will be able to get a college degree. They will be able to make it to the middle class, and that is what we have got to accomplish. Furthermore, we are living in a country which has another absurdity with regard to the financing of higher education. At a time when we want to encourage people of all ages to get more education, to be more highly skilled on their jobs, we have the absurdity of millions of young people and not so young people who are trying to deal with horrendously oppressive student debt loans. And these debts sometimes consume 20 or 25% of the income of individuals. They radically change lifestyles. People are not getting married, they're not having kids, they're not buying homes because they're paying off their student debt. Now I ask you, what sense does it make when you can go out and refinance your home today at 2 or 3%, and yet millions of people are struggling with student debt interest rates of 6, 7, 9%. We've got to allow those people to refinance their student debt. Furthermore, it makes no sense to me that the federal government is making billions of dollars in profit off of high interest rates that come from low-income and working-class families whose crime it is that they want their kids to get a college education. The United States government should not be profiteering off of the debt owed by working-class families who want their kids to get an education. Brothers and sisters, let me just conclude by once again thanking you for the great work that you are doing, the very difficult work that you do, and ask you to work with me to think big. This is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We should not have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country. This is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We should not be the only major country on earth that does not guarantee health care to all people as a right. The debate that we should be having now is not whether we cut education by 2% or 4%, whether we throw 5 million people off of health insurance or 27 million people off of health insurance. The debate that we should be having is to make certain that health care is a right in our country, not a privilege, The debate we should be having is to make sure that every parent in America can have quality and affordable child care, and where all of our qualified young people, regardless of income, can go to college. The debate we should be having is not whether we're going to cut Social Security, but whether we're going to expand Social Security for those seniors who are struggling. So, brothers and sisters, there is a lot of work to be done. But when we stand up and say to those people on top whose greed has done so much damage to this country, when we say to the billionaire class that they cannot have it all, that this country belongs to all of us and not just a few, when we do that, there is no limit to what this great country cannot accomplish. Thank you so much for allowing me to be with you today.